This show is part of the Darkmoor Podcast Network.
To join our community Discord or see more content from our members, visit darkmoorpodcasts.com.
On today's episode, we celebrate our 100th episode, where we answer fan questions on player tips, world building, and online play. This is the DM Shower Thoughts. Welcome back. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the DM Shower Thoughts, the show where we talk about our shower thoughts in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, as well as many other tabletop scenarios, and how to become your best self through gaming. My name is Adamus.
I'm John.
And I'm Ian.
And this is our 100th episode! We've been doing this a while. And we thought it was cool to take a lot of fan questions. We've accumulated a number of questions on our various pages here and there. Some people have sent me things to Adam Strike Productions. Some people have sent things to DM Shower Thoughts. Some people have just sent me things personally. And I think we've procured a list of cool questions, which is going to be awesome. So we're going to take this in a not really a round robin. It's we'll each present a question for discussion, and we'll just see where our thoughts take us. And when we think we've come to a conclusion, we'll go to the next one. It'll be wonderful. And before I get started, thank you very much to everyone who submitted questions. If you have a question while you're listening to this that didn't get answered on the podcast, leave it in the comments down below, and we can address it in future episodes as well, because there's always a conversation to be had. So we're going to kick things off with this first question, which is someone asked, which class is right for me? Which is such a what an interesting little question.
And this is kind of this was like a sarcastic question. Like it was
I remember the person who asked this. And like what's right for me? Go ahead, John.
So and I really this is one of those really big player-based questions that every new player that doesn't really know where to start is going to ask, which class should I start with? You know, should I be a fighter? Should I be a wizard? And most people have some idea of D&D, like they know that wizards is a part of the game, you know, or whatever. To me, this is obviously a question we could spend an entire episode just kind of delving into, helping players choose the right class that they want to play. But I usually start with a really simple tool, which is I just ask, based on their character, would they rather fight using weapons or using magic? And that divides the list by half, right? And I always exclude Artificer from this list, not only because it requires specific materials, but because not every setting is going to be appropriate for it, and its mechanics are overwhelming for a new player. So, but pretty much if they are like, hey, you know, I want to use a weapons-based character. Well, now it comes down to a simpler division. You know, do you want to be up close and personal, or do you want to be far away and shoot them? And then from there, it's pretty divided, you know? So if they want to get up close and hit them, barbarian, paladin, you know, maybe a fighter. And then you can ask them more specific questions to kind of diagnose what play style they're looking for. So if they want someone that's going to be really tough and can take a hit, barbarian. If they want someone that has like magic sword attacks, paladin. And if they want to shoot stuff, I usually lead them toward like fighter or rogue. Maybe ranger if I'm willing to like customize the features a little bit so it works. And then if they want to do more of a magic class, you know, I just ask, well, what does your magic do? Does it help people? Does it blast them? Do you use fire or ice, or, you know, basically how do they want their magic to work? And that can help them kind of diagnose to the other classes. And sometimes, you know, I'll have this where I have a friend who only looks at memes. Well, what do bards do? And I tell them, and then I figure out if that's something they actually want, you know? So really, which class is right for you? What would you be excited playing? And I always make sure, especially for new players, divorce the mechanics from the story, because they'll have an idea of what the bard is, but really they can actually play that concept better as a rogue, because the rogue also gets expertise and stuff. Or they have an idea of what a wizard is, but really a sorcerer or warlock makes sense based on what they envision their wizard to do. So like I always find that you can kind of, if you can figure out how they want to play, that's what helps you determine what class is right for them.
Precisely. And I like to use that kind of track that you've introduced before. I think we have a video on it on our YouTube channel, really specifically kind of delving into how to break it down so we're approaching what we want. And then I'll also have the experience of we'll do that process, and then someone will start to play, and we'll still have, it's much rarer now, but we'll still have moments where someone will start to play this class and then go, that I don't think I want this. But you reserve the right to change your mind. It's that your character and your class doesn't have to be set in stone. I've had times where, like by session 4, someone has after the session said, I think I actually would want to be a sorcerer instead of a warlock. I'm looking at things, and should I multi-class or and then we'll talk it out and we'll decide, what? It's probably better if we just respec. We go back to the beginning, we take all your attributes and everything, and we just redistribute them so that you fit into sorcerer this time, and then you play with those mechanics. And more often than not, that's exactly what we have to do. It makes it better. So you can go through that whole process, and then if you discover through play, through experience, you might have a concept in your head, and then it will change as you are playing. You'll get an idea in play that, I thought I wanted this, but I think I want this. Great, you can change. You can go through that entire process and then decide, this is what I really wanted, and see it out.
Yeah, I guess the last part of that is on the DM side of it, because this is a player-based question. Recognizing what a player wants from their story, and also being willing to add either magic items or features they can work towards, something that can help them fulfill their character concept. Because multi-classing, I love the puzzle of multi-classing characters, but there are just times where it doesn't make sense to multi-class. It doesn't really, you really need that one little feature, but you don't want to invest 7 levels of rogue to get it, Sometimes there's just other ways that you can do. It might be I sacrifice another feature from my class progression, but I get this equal feature from a different class progression, I think it's called a Gestalt character when you do that. Yeah. It is, as the dungeon master, you also reserve the right to help give your players tools to help satisfy certain storytelling moments, not just to abuse the game system,
Yes.
The next question is, what type of story or setting do you like to run best, and why?
I think mine is obvious at this point in time, but it does have a caveat, or I guess an extension. So I have the benefit of running IO, which has been going for 4 or 5 years now, of actually building it up. And by tying it back into that world, there's a strong running history, and I enjoy setting things up and then breaking them. And now that we've established there's a multiverse to IO, it gives me a lot of freedom to allow my players to have weight and legacy. And if they're in a different age, like say they're in the past age, then there can be a branching path for them anyway. They don't have to feel like they're typecast or scripted into, well, I can't stop the apocalypse anyway, and we know it's coming. There might be divergent paths. And I really like it because it has a rich, immersive space that people can explore. I like it because it keeps surprising me in how the players are choosing to interact in this setting, and then how that changes my interpretations of where things could go. Like we had last night, somebody is building a god inside of them. A new god is about to be born, I guess, and they ate a cleric of someone else's god. And that was not in my plan. It wasn't something I was like, oh yeah, that could probably happen. it was the cultivation of the players cooperatively telling a story and going, well, maybe that could work, and then conversing with this deity in training, and then by them doing that action, what does that do? Not only to this creature that's becoming a god, but what does it do to the creature that was connected to that cleric, and what ripples could that have, and how does that add extra weight to the decisions of those players in IO, especially in the Sixth Age where things are kind of broken. It's really fun for me to think about, well, what seed of chaos was just planted, and how do those ripples affect campaigns moving forward? How are they going to affect immediacy? How are they going to affect things down the line? Would this be a secondary adventure for those book one characters in a legacy 20th level, one shot? Could that be a thing? And it's, in a lot of ways, I can write this setting around and have these huge, expansive narrative possibilities. But it's the intimate, intricate details that the players have been making that's made the most change and has been the most rewarding for me to witness. I think in the very beginning of me DMing, I was very protective of my world, and I think as we let go of more and more of that vanity, it kind of starts to blow up in front of us. In a lot of ways, it kind of writes itself. Like once you understand that in my case, the character of the setting, it writes itself. And it's about the players interacting inside of it. And then the final adage from there is, it is really fun to take the world of Pugmire, which is my other setting that I really enjoy, which is not mine, and to sort of expand upon it, because it's a dichotomous space, that it looks cute and fluffy, but it's a post-apocalyptic hexscape. And it's all of humanity is dead, and it's just like, it can get really sad and dark, but it has all of this levity because you're dogs and cats, and it's such a strange juxtaposition that I really enjoy existing in that setting. And the game mechanic is very team oriented. It's very like, there's team initiative, there's team inspiration that you decide upon as a group of what would be the best story to tell here, if they can justify it. It's really a cool setting, and that's a game system, but the setting is fascinating to me because it could go so dark and yet it's cute and fluffy. And I like things that have conflicting ideas that are active.
So, well, one of the things that we've talked about is that IO as a world, depending on the age that you're playing in, will have drastically different tones, or as you just said, a drastically different character, as well as the different planes, like you're running a Shadowfell game versus a Feywild game versus a material plane game in the various ages. Yeah. Is there one of those settings that you like, specific parts of IO that you like running more than others?
I think lately I am most pleased and most surprised with the Shadowfell game. And that's because in Legacy, I broke Legacy. The Shadowfell is sad and it's terrible and no adventurers. And to sort of adjust the lore to allow for adventurers has opened the door to this very interesting motes of gray heroism in the forms of the adventurers. And all the adventurers are trying to do the best they can in, like, surrounded by gothic horror, like surrounded by dark and terrible things, not terrible things in the sense of mature themes and, punishing tragic consequences, more as, oh, that's a vampire, maybe I shouldn't mess with that. Well, I still need to talk to him, so how do we navigate that? There's a lot of creative solutions that not only the players, but I've had to make in this world to make it function as a place where heroes and villains could exist. But everything has this shade of darkness of evil. Like, these are not necessarily good creatures, but how could it then function as a society? And it has to function as a society. It's a plane. There are cities. There are civilizations. So of course it functions as a society. How does it do that? And it's really cool to go deep into that setting to make it work as a structure. If I had to spend a campaign here, there's a beginning, middle, and end. That makes sense. Whereas usually when you hear about the Shadowfell, you don't get a lot of explanation. And there are many different interpretations of the plane of shadow. And the maps have continued to change over time. And now it's more of a concept almost in 5th edition. There might be some people out there that are getting angry on their keyboards, but it's pretty, it's from the Shadowfell, and who knows where they're from in the Shadowfell. It's just, they're from the Shadowfell, and it's this broad idea. So in making that a structured space has been really, really cool. And then the flip side is Feywild, by making it a structure, has been extremely rewarding, because it has tangible cities and tangible economies and races and like a system, and making the Fey courts function has had a huge impact. But I think Shadowfell wins right now in terms of being my favorite setting currently, because it's during the 4th age of Io, so they're dealing with not the river Styx, but the ocean Styx. And there's this strange, like, dark piracy that exists in this gray parallel to the material world. So you have Mind Flayer corsairs and flesh merchants that are on boats, and they have ships that regenerate themselves because they're made from undead, like wights. And it's grisly and gothic without being violent and gross. And that makes it a really neat landscape to explore, kind of just pushing a little bit on darker themes without having to go full Grey Owls mode.
Yeah, and I do think that the biggest part of our settings that we most enjoy is the immersion. And for me, that immersion has mostly been inspired by the Ravenloft setting. My favorite campaign so far that I've run is Curse of Strahd. I haven't finished it yet, but I have drawn a lot of elements from the Ravenloft setting into my custom world of Corsara, which has only been recently developed. So for me, I would say that Gothic horror is pretty cool, but I like taking it and putting my own twist on it, so that it's not just this monotonous kind of Gothic horror that sometimes can happen with these kinds of settings, because you can't just have a gloomy, dreary world all the time without anything to compare it to, because otherwise it's not gloomy and dreary anymore. It's just the world as it is, and bad things happen all the time, and you can't really do anything about it. That's what I like the Curse of Strahd book, because it does say in the front of the book that it's up to you to create these shades of light that you can see in the world. So like flowers or something, some a ray of sunlight just somehow breaking through the clouds at some point and landing on some flowers, or seeing the good in the people that are trapped there. Now, what I really like about that is that the closer you are to the castle Ravenloft, more dreary and gloomy these people are. But the further you get away, they start behaving more realistically almost, because they're not as oppressed by the shadow of the castle. So that would definitely be my favorite story so far. But I am looking into, like I said, my own custom region, and taking inspiration from places like Waterdeep or the Sword Coast in general. So that's probably my favorite so far.
Yeah, I've played I've ran a few different settings, and I think really when I look for like what my favorite type of setting is, no matter what the tone of the game is, they all have a few things in common. So the favorite settings I have to run, like you said, Ian, are ones that are immersive. And they're usually immersive because I've had the opportunity to get my players on board with them first. So like when I ran Cursed Castle, which is my shrunken down Curse of Strahd, right? It was my players knew they were walking into Gothic horror. You know, when I ran Dragon Heist, my players knew they were walking into social interaction, dealing with nobles. There's going to be a heist at some point, you know, and really the practice of figuring out how to reduce my players' resistances or barriers that might come up when they have to face a new setting. The latest expression of that is Geras, which is like custom world I'm running. Which these all end up being the custom worlds we're running right now, but it's why it's the custom world, right? It's the underlying thing, and it's because I like settings that allow players to have room to have intimate moments with each other, and by intimate I mean like emotionally intimate. So yes. Like, you know, I've both participated and ran games that have a big overarching epic plot. Right? Like Storm King's Thunder, Tyranny of Dragons. But the things that made those games great wasn't the big fight or the big overarching plot. It was the character interactions with each other and the relationships they built along the way, you know? And the games where the players weren't interested in exploring those dynamics were the ones I found kind of draining because the plot didn't matter. You know, it's like they wanted to slay the giants because they wanted to slay the giants, as opposed to, you know, like in Tyranny of Dragons, where we need to stop Tiamat because I was raised in a cult of Tiamat where they abused me and scarred me, and I want to make sure that doesn't happen to somebody else. Or I want to stop Tiamat because the cult of Tiamat raided the village and killed my mother. You know, there was some kind of hook that created an emotional investment into the overarching story. And although Geras is my favorite one right now, because so far it's the most refined, all of the games I've played that I've really enjoyed running have that as a common characteristic. That even if it was a one shot, if the players invested in each other a little bit, and invested in the overall plot, right? Like they had an emotional investment in actually adventuring and caring. Those are the ones that have been the most enjoyable.
I'm finding, as a very quick aside, with Grey Owls, we just had Team Tree Chapter 20A last night, and so much of Grey Owls is close social interaction. What we're discovering with, even as we're approaching, you know, the end game, it isn't necessarily the big fight at the end that matters. It's the interactions leading up to it. It's the interactions afterwards. It's the big reveals during our conversations and during moments where we get to like question people, or we get to reconnect with other NPCs, or reconnect with each other, or connect with characters that have been missing for a little bit of time. And in doing so, they share with the information that they got. And suddenly that little bit, when you have information on your own, and information is kind of a currency in a setting, and you share it, and then the big reveals, those are the end bosses. That's what matters. In a way, like the big boss is trying to figure out the secret behind this thing. Like, how does it all fit together? That's the end boss. And what we discovered last night was people were just expositing at the end when we stopped the session for our cliffhanger for the next time. But they were like, you know, we're coming up on this big fight. And though we are excited for the big fight, also, we could skip that big fight and still go through all of the social interactions and all the explorations and find out all the other cool things that are close and intimate to us, and still be satisfied. Like, we could do that for another, 24 hours and be fine. In recognizing that, it's what do we value? And I'm seeing that the most in Shadowfell, that they're not, the first time when we had this group, they were going like from fight to fight to fight to fight to fight, because they're learning the mechanics of the game, and that's kind of where I thought they were. But now they've all evolved to avoiding fights, or, you know what, how do we outsmart this conflict, and how do we strengthen our own connections? They've had so many more social interactions with each other and with other characters, and with contacting people and trying to build rapport and, strike deals. It's been so much more about that personal journey. And maybe your BBEG is the personal goal, and it has the overarching themes don't have to be the the end all be all.
Yeah, the one thing I have to say on that is that when you have a social interaction that ties into the combat, it makes the combat more meaningful.
Yeah.
The one thing that combat does add to social interaction, like to flip it,
Mhm.
is that it provides risk, right?
Yes.
And that's what gets that investment, you know? It's like you don't get the social interaction, you don't get the cutscene of the fight reveal unless you can understand the risk going into it, you know? So are you willing to risk this, basically your hit points, your character, your identity, with this dynamic interaction? Because to me, that's what I find the most engaging combat is also a kind of social interaction.
Yeah.
It's just expressed slightly differently. It's expressed with mechanics as well as with description, you know? So when you start viewing it as that, it's no longer, you know, do we need to fight or do we need a social interaction? It's the fight is part social interaction.
Yes. And I think that's also what made last night very satisfying is there were 2 combats, and those combats had massive reveals in terms of everyone's personal convictions, as well as how they were choosing to express them and how they were choosing to speak to their combatants. There's a lot more than just I move up and hit it. We've evolved well beyond that to include all the pillars of play at once in some cases. And it's less, I want to say it's more structured, but it's also less structured because it all flows together. And it's my favorite games and settings are places where there's less resistance. We know what we're getting into up front, and we're willing to flow into interactions inside and out of combat, as long as they're all satisfying.
Yeah, and actually, on that note, one of my favorite things is when there's a trigger in combat that causes the social interaction, but it's not something like it's something slightly out of the box. So, like, say say your character dies or something, and then you have the opportunity to talk with the deity that you've been following or something like that, or the deity has been, you know, observing this. And for example, when Elb died the first time, he got a chance to go back, but he had to give up something as well, and that became a really interesting social interaction for him because he had to speak with Auril, the Archfey. So that's something that I really enjoy, is when there's something you've been kind of waiting for that's kind of built into your character, but you know it won't happen until there's a super defining moment. That's what really gets me excited. So our next question is, how has the COVID adaptations gone for various groups, and what are the pros and cons of playing online versus tabletop? And John, you can take the first answer if you like.
Yeah, awesome. All right. So it's funny because I sort of just typed in the thing. So this is one, just to let you know, we're going to kind of answer a little more shortly here. But if you want, I think around episode 81 through like 90, we really explore a lot of dimensions to this question, because this is a very, very multi-dimensional question. So just to kind of sum up some of the pros and cons really quick. I find that the pros to an online experience are that I find it, for me, more immersive, because it's a lot easier for the dungeon master to pull up visuals and audio without needing to worry about like passing around the handout or making sure that you print with enough ink or anything like that, or that your your equipment cuts out, you know? So I find that it's actually easier to immerse myself in the experience. With online, I feel like it's easier to dispense information as well, that you're playing a lot less catch up of like, wait, what did that person just say? Oh, wait, they tried to share a secret, you know? Like, because you have a chat log, you have a running record of everything that's happening. Like, even if something happens where, you know, your power surges, so, you know, you don't quite hear something the right way, you can just read the chat log if you're playing that style, which is the one I prefer, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you do have to type everything out, so it's going to be a slower experience. So if you're a little less patient with your with typing out and making sure you're really thinking through your responses, this is going to probably be a much more grating experience, because, you know, you just want the next thing to happen. I will say online, you're at the mercy of your connection speed. So if you do have faulty equipment or you don't have the fastest internet or there are constant cutouts, that is probably going to be a restriction to play. And you do lose your elements of acting. So I know a lot of players, one of the things they value is doing accents and voices and conveying the emotion of their character audibly. These are things that I find I actually like online play better. I like having it written out and everything. I can't speak highly enough about that. I know that's very opinionated, and I know that's like my opinion, and a lot of people are welcome to disagree with me. I've just found that my both DMing and playing have been much more enriching and much more satisfying, and I can look back on everything that happened because it's clearer and there's less misunderstanding. So even though it's a slower experience, it's a more impactful experience.
That's where I slide back into the pros and cons, because having to adapt into Roll20 has been highly influential in terms of making sure I have the right visuals. And before Roll20, I would at least like print things out and display them, and people could go pick them up and look at them. When it comes to my peripherals, I would make physical objects that players would interact with, or I'd hand them a scroll, or I'd hand them a cigar, which is a spell thing, like basically a spell scroll, and then I know, and it's labeled, and they have like physical objects that they're interacting with, which for some of my players, that's huge because it is so acting oriented. They love emoting and being and saying things in voices, and it's in the moment. When you play on Roll20, you have to be patient. It's a lot of sort of stepping back and letting the text of the story flow. You have to sort of curb the initial feeling of I need to say what I would need to say right now, because there's also a sound delay. Like if you do that too much, you start talking over each other and just becomes a noise and nobody gets anything. So if you're going to do it in an acting medium, you still have to wait, because there have to be structures in place so that we don't lose information. Also, tech issues exist. We had a ton of tech issues last night, and they slowed down play and they would interrupt flow. We still got our satisfying experience, but we are now used to the idea of, okay, we kind of pause these interactions now and we restart everything so that people can get back into it. But, oh man, I missed that whole interaction because my internet reset is really, really rough. Like sometimes people have to change computers. They have to change house locations. Their internet just decides to drop them. Roll20 decides to kick them out of the game. And whereas if you've set up the right protocols in the social contract of how the game is going to be run, when those tech issues present themselves, because we know they're going to be a certainty, you're going to have something go wrong. Instead of it being a game-breaking thing, it's just it's a minor inconvenience because you have procedures in place to get yourself back in, and then you go up the chat, you read what you missed, and now you're back. But you have to be okay with that. If that upsets your flow too much, then it's maybe not the setting for you. But I've learned so much about immersion and making sure I have the right visuals present and making sure all my maps are preloaded in a way. So I already have the placements of at least the enemies, and reorganizing myself so I have the right folders and tokens to pull in at the right times so that there's less waiting, because there's already so much waiting, has been truly informative and influential in just my storytelling experience across the board. COVID, Roll20, Discord, live or not.
Yeah, for me as a new DM, this is really where I came into my own style of being a DM and creating these stories for my players, because I started DMing with I would say I guess technically I started DMing with Tyranny of Dragons, which was online, but I wouldn't say I was doing very well. I really consider the starting point of my DMing career right before COVID-19, because I was running Curse of Strahd with you guys, Adam, and a couple other people. And that was all live. That was at the table. And I was really enjoying it. I thought it was going very well. I was surprised how much I wasn't reading off of my, prepared scripts, quote unquote, and things like that. And just having that creative flow going with, inspiring each other and figuring out how to improv these kinds of descriptions that I didn't even consider, because it's one thing to plan something out by yourself. It's another to actually bring it to the table and then have the players do something entirely different. Like, look at things that don't matter. It was really cool. But then COVID-19. So I moved all my stuff over to Roll20, and I was forced. I was put under pressure to adapt how I was DMing and prepare scripts. Personally, this is how I do it. Prepare scripts so that I can just read them and put them into the chat so everybody else can read them and remember what it says, because not everyone hears everything that you say as you're saying it. And that also inspired me to have backdrops. I didn't really have any backdrops at the table or anything. It was all just like there was a map when we were using our tokens, or not tokens, minis. And then there was also maybe like a couple of cool little images, but no like backdrops. And I think that with the online stuff, with Roll20, it allows you to become more immersed when you have those backdrops, because it helps your theater of the mind kind of solidify what you're looking at. And that's what I really like about it. I do say that I prefer being at the table when I play, and probably when I DM as well. But there is something to be said for the online experience of the text-based adventure, because you're basically writing a book together. And I really like that. I love seeing what other people bring to the table and how they're portraying their characters, because like John said, sometimes it's just easier to figure out what your character would say or what they would do or how they would do it even when you're just typing it up, because there's something about translating the imagery in your head into words on the keyboard that is sometimes just easier than talking. And I think there's a lot to be said about that. On the other hand, like I said, I love feeding off of the creative energy in the room and acting and improvising my stuff at the table. So I think that I will probably, once COVID-19 is, to a state where we can actually meet again, I will probably still have at the table sessions, but sometimes, it's not possible, and that's what Roll20 is there for.
Yeah. So when people ask about specifically DMing and how COVID has affected us, when it comes to like a new DM, do you think that it's okay for them to? You think it's a good idea or a bad idea to go into Roll20 or Discord when you're new, or is it better to wait in person? And why? I have some thoughts.
Do you want to go first, or do you
Sure.
want me?
I think it depends on your style as a person. But we know already now that there's a different kind of prep, and it's a different layer of prep when it comes to Roll20 and the Discord world. You're going to need to do a lot more front loading in order for things to flow, I think, quickly, because you're already doing a lot of waiting. You already have to be pretty patient with a chat log and being able to type things out, and then connection issues. So you want to have as much ready up front as you can. And of course, things are going to happen where you're like, I just need an image. Hang on, guys. I'll bring this thing in. But you want to avoid that as much as possible. It's nice to have a nice, book ready to go in the map set or the cover portraits or photos, whatever you're going to use. So it's how much time do you have to invest? If you have a fair amount of time, then I think it makes sense for you to use and to practice on Roll20. Because you can learn on it, you can, but you have to know up front that, and maybe your players need to know up front that this might be a little slow. The flow is going to be different. Whereas at the table, I think we have a lot more opportunity to pants. I can like fly by the seat of our pants and say, okay, quick rules and go. And there's a lot more of that organic play off of each other if you're also comfortable with improv.
So having been a DM who started DMing, like I didn't get to play before I started DMing, and having taught new DMs how to DM, or I have at least been in the position that, they're willing to stop the game to basically ask my opinion on mechanical ruling. I think that new DMs are going to DM slower because they're going to be less confident in their rulings to start out. So already there's a slowdown there, even if you're at the table. And you're right, there is more of an opportunity to pants or to react. But I think if you're going to if you're like a newer DM and you want to try Roll20 in Discord, I think the first question you have to ask is, have you participated in a game as a player? So you understand what your players would be seeing as the DM. If you're going to try to DM in this way, but you haven't experienced the receiving end of it, it's going to make it so much more difficult to deliver the experience that you want to deliver, For me, I also had Ian, who had used Roll20 much more than I did. We set an appointment where he basically logged in and he walked me through the tools and how to use them. So I had a mentor in a way to be able to help me make the transition. Now, before COVID-19, before I had to use Roll20, I was a very reactive DM, where it was mostly, what do my players want to do and how as the DM am I going to respond to them? And I did that a little bit in the first Roll20 game I really ran, which was Mad Mage, and it was really bad. Mad Mage was all right. We pulled it off, but it was far from the experience I wanted to deliver. So I think that you have to, like you said, Adam, you have to front load a lot more when you're doing this, and you have to be comfortable engaging with the technology that you're using. If you're one of these people that, you're struggling to figure out if you should be using like Chrome or, Safari or whatever, like it's going to be like exponentially difficult to the point that I wouldn't recommend it. I've also had like a newer DM text me and be like, I'm thinking about doing Roll20. Gave her the warning. She tried it. It was a disaster, So it's definitely one of those things where if you're not confident with the technology, the slower pace, the front loading prep and having answers ready to go, then it's going to be it's not going to work very well for you. Yeah.
And taking all of those things into account, for somebody who had to grow through Roll20 as their first like real, hardcore DMing experiences, it can act as a catalyst. So if you are able to shine under pressure, or you're able to come up with creative storytelling because you like to write creative stories or something, this can be really good. And really conducive to that kind of a front-loading mentality. So personally, I would recommend it, but only taking all of those other things into consideration. And it's still going to take time to invest. So just because it's online and you can play whenever you want, doesn't mean that you're going to just be able to come up with a story 5 hours before a session. You still need to take the time to look at what your world is, what your setting is, look at your players especially, and think about what would be an exciting story and then map it out. But also taking into consideration that it's still D&D. So there's still going to be some stuff that goes wrong or that just changes in general. I've had NPCs where I've had dialogue for them that I never use. And that's because the players interact with them differently than I was anticipating. So it's okay. And you have to accept that. I think one thing you also really need to take into consideration when doing Roll20 is that some people are very text-based and some people still want to use their voices to act out these things. And for that means you're going to have to come up with like some sort of just some rules of conduct, really, saying like, try not to talk over each other. Use push to talk, for example, on Discord. That can be really useful. Or if you have like a microphone that you can turn off and on. Another thing is potentially like raising hands and then the DM calls on you, because, you still do that at the table, and that's more aligning yourself towards what it would be like in person. Not all the players are, you would hope anyway, that the players aren't going to talk over each other and shout over each other and say, DM, I have this thing and I'm going to do it. And then they just go and describe it without you saying, okay, tell me what you're doing. And those are some of the things you have to take into consideration when going on to Roll20 immediately. But it can be very, very rewarding, speaking from my own experience.
And I wonder if mastering in a lot of ways is a way to kind of upgrade and do all this from a holistic experience. You can have people that prefer voices, but still will benefit from text. You might have people that prefer text, but could still benefit from voice. And you have to find a middle ground that's comfortable for everyone without compounding it. And that's why there's those a code of conduct is really important, but it's also helpful to recognize that we all kind of learn differently and we all immerse a bit differently. Now, I don't think that, you should do everything at once, because that in and of itself becomes convoluted. So having a consistent code of conduct, depending on your table, is super helpful. Last night, I do text descriptions, but those are more for accuracy, and we talk a lot. But there's a lot of this, and they make sure that now they have a better understanding where their cameras are, and they know that I'll be watching them, and I put their faces at my eye level so I'm not looking down. And it's just these little things of saying, okay, it's this person, and now it's this person, and now it's this person. And hold on, let's see, maybe they're going to do something that will change the way you're doing that. But just that tiny adjustment of taking their avatars and putting them at the top of the screen instead of where their default is at the bottom has made such a difference in making sure that I'm always, eye contact, I'm always checking them. And that has exponentially improved all of that for those, has exponentially improved the experience of that particular group. But then I'll have another group that is text-based, and we try, actually, I don't do a lot of voices. I do voices because I'm comfortable with it. It helps me. But I'll also put whatever I'm saying in the chat, so I can say it like I'm reading a story, but then the people that want to listen can. The people whose tech doesn't give out will hear it. If their tech does give out, they still see it. And the people who don't want to listen still see it. So you get everybody that would enjoy those different elements. Even though the code of conduct is text first, you could still include the DM reading the description in voice. And then there's an extra layer there, but you don't miss the first thing. Nobody misses all the details because they're in the first form of the conduct. It's cool because you can find this holistic balance point of being able to upgrade your text descriptions so everything's accurate, and you could still act. It's just that one doesn't negate the other, and if you lose like one of these, especially the text part, stays. There's a permanence to it when you're online, and it's a different way of thinking, so that you work on your descriptions and keep them accurate and type them out, and then you can act them out if you like, but then it's there for the people that need the text so they don't get lost. It's really important. I mean, you might have people that express, I know I'm talking a lot, that express, push to talk, and then have no texting. It's voice only. And then you lose the people that really need the text as a grounding principle. But if I do text only, I might lose the people that really need the vocal interaction, even just a little bit, to help ground them in what's happening. So
yeah, I would say that the last part of this, to kind of just wrap it all together, is practice recognizing what honestly works, not what you want to work. Because there's been so many times I've gone to DM a game and a player's been like, well, I think if we do this, it'll make it all better. I think if we find a balance between asking questions and text, it'll all work. And that's when everything falls apart, right? Yeah. So I found, like, for me, my workflow is usually, you can say it out but if it doesn't get included in the text chat, it doesn't happen in game, right? So like if you want to say something, like you got to type it first or else you get ignored, you know? So usually the way I do it is if they have a question that's out of game, they ask me with like text as like an immediate thing, you know? But because it's quicker. But when it comes to what we consider like canon, like to the world, if it's not text, it doesn't happen, you know? And I found that when people tried to ask me or say my character does this and they just say it, I lose everybody on the text and people don't get heard. People feel like they're not having fun. You know, it really is. And if they want to type it out and then say like express the voice with their own character, it can add a lot. But the text is the safeguard from the gameplay completely falling apart.
Yeah. Yep.
Oh, I'm asking the next one. So this one's real like nuts and bolts. Minimum and what is the minimum and maximum number of players for a new DM, and what do you think your preferred player styles would be for a new DM? Adam and I have the same answer. Minimum of 4, maximum of 5. Yeah. I would go so far as to say if you're gonna to loop it to the last question, if you're gonna run to Roll20, no more than 4. You do 4, right? You don't have less than 4. You don't have more than 4. You have 4. Because more than 4, the internet connection thing is gonna become an issue. Less than 4, you don't have as many dynamics going on at the same time, and you can't cover all of your party's roles. Having played a game of like 3 people, you can't cover everybody's roles. So
oh yeah, and that's precisely it. And then the other part of it, like the styles of play for a new DM, I think I think that having styles of players, there might be players that tend toward certain ideas, like we have reactive and proactive, and then we have a whole other spread of that kind of wraps around. But I wonder if we can more basically approach it as you need players that are going to be patient with the DM and buy into what they're trying to do. Like you want players that are not going to be antagonistic to a new DM. So many of the forum posts I read where I'm a first time DM and this player is just really, really trying hard to mess everything up, and I don't know what's going on. And you need players that are not going to be antagonists, like they don't have that relationship. Or if they do, to be okay with changing that relationship, understanding this is not an antagonistic relationship, or understanding, hey, I'm learning. We're going to focus on having a cooperatively good time. And that's our goal. It isn't me versus you. And unfortunately, there's a tradition of D&D in the mainstream legacy of it, the social legacy of whole generations of GMs that are antagonistic with their players. And some people buy into that. And it's just, you want players that will buy into the experience you're trying to have and understand that you're figuring it out.
Yeah, for me, I would say that my preferred style is probably along those lines where you're invested in the story, but you also have your own ideas of what you want your character to do and stuff, your character goals. I am excited when my players tell me this is my character's like overarching goal. Like they have a motive already planned. I don't have to like come up with something that will hopefully motivate them and then hope it succeeds also. Because sometimes I've come up with motives and I'm like, this is going to be a great motive. This character, like, let's just say there's a NPC death or something. This NPC is going to die and this character is going to be all like emotionally attached, and they're going to go and like look for vengeance or something like that. And sometimes that doesn't work. It's just really funny when it doesn't. You think it's going to work, and then they're just like, oh, that sucks. But one of the things that I think is kind of funny is, and you know, the antagonistic player is pretty interesting to deal with, because sometimes they like say it outright to you. They're like, my whole goal is kind of just, I want to see what I can mess with in your world. And I'm like, okay, sure. I'm glad you told me up front. And I've actually had a player recently in a campaign session where they had the invisibility spell, so they turned themselves invisible and went out onto the school campus that night, because we were in an academy setting, and that's not allowed really, because there's a curfew, so there's like guards and stuff hanging out, and looking to make sure all the students are in their dorms, and they're invisible. So I'm like, okay, you walk around, you come up to closer to some of these guards. They make movements towards you as though they can see you, and they're like, okay, if I move like this, do they react? And it's like, yeah, absolutely. It seems like they can see people who are invisible, and they're like, oh. That's not good. So just before curfew actually hit, they managed to scamper off to the dorm again. But that was a way that I kind of turned it around, because that could have turned into like a really long, solo mission that we don't really like to do too much in D&D, because it just takes time away from the rest of the party. And so that's what I think you can kind of do to create restrictions for antagonistic characters that they may suffer consequences from, as opposed to just saying, oh, I go and break this window and I run away. And it's like, oh, well, somebody might have heard that, things like that.
And I think antagonistic, I mean, you can still be an antagonist. You can play an antagonist. You can play even a chaotic character. But when it comes to the player and how the player interacts with the DM, it's a sense of, I'm going to work with you, not fight with you. That's what you need, I think, because you're learning the game too. And they're learning the game, I hope. I mean, everybody's going to be learning together consistently, but especially a new DM is learning the game. So if you have veteran players or not veteran players, if you have other DMs at the table or not, I think the focus when I say an antagonistic player, there are so many players out there today that think it's me versus the DM. I have to outsmart the DM. I have to destroy what they're doing. I have to like break whatever their challenge is. I have to go by raw and outthink the loopholes of the DM. And it's not you versus them. You're working with the DM. There's a cooperative storytelling experience here. And those can have challenges, and those can have, puzzles and difficulties and, things like that. You can still challenge your players, of course, and they can still have deadly encounters. But the end philosophy is having players at the table that understand, I'm going to work with you, not fight with you. And if you have a rules thing, I guess that's also the big thing, is if you put a social contract out, even if it's small, just, this is my goal at the table. We're going to have fun. We're going to work with each other. I'm going to get the rules wrong, and that's okay. And we'll figure it out. We'll look it up together. If you have a problem with it, you're going to talk to me after. If it's a big thing and it might be the difference between killing your character, we can discuss it in the middle. And we're not going to be rude to each other. And then you're done. And if the players are not antagonistic players, they'll buy into that. And that's good. If they break that social contract, that's not who you want at your table. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think really to tie it in, because remember, we're talking about a new DM. So I can like name a few names of people I know that know D&D. They know the system, they know characters and how they work, they know classes. But when you start DMing, you start seeing the game from a new dimension. So they're not necessarily learning the game. They're learning, sometimes they're still learning the game, but they're learning a new dimension to the game, and there's a lot that they're juggling. So I think in terms of player styles you want to look for, Adam said it brilliantly in that you want players that are willing to work with you. And it's okay to have a player that's going to mess with you so long as they aren't harming the dynamic of the players at the other table.
Yeah.
So if you have 3 players that are looking for some kind of immersive storytelling thing, and you have one player that's trying to botch the mechanics in certain ways to undermine the effort of the other players that they're trying to do, that's a different thing, I think that it's awesome if you're a new DM and you're upfront with what you kind of want out of your experience. The one I think back on is I was playing a game with a new DM, and he made it very clear, there are going to be times I'm going to stop all of the action to understand the different ruling options I have, where it's like, and if you have one player that's a rules lawyer in that they basically have an encyclopedic knowledge of the rules and systems without the needing to have it their way, I think that having one of those is a good ally to have. If you have more than one of them, they'll argue with each other. So a lot of it was like, I remember it being like, he'd stop and he'd be like, all right, well, the book to me is a little unclear on how to rule this. How would you rule it? And I'd usually say, this is how I would rule it based on the world that seems to be established. If you know something different as the DM of you want the experience to be different, then this is another option that you have. This is my perspective. You don't have to go with it, but this is another option. I think that can be really, having a player like that and then having players that agree to the experience. I think that's going to produce the best, kind of new DM session running, if that makes sense.
It does make sense.
All right. So our next question has to do with the D&D races and the player options that people have when creating their character. When running a campaign, would you rather let your players run wild, quote unquote, with the options, or establish guidelines before the campaign starts about what kind of races they can play? For me, I just have kind of a short answer. It's really not so much restricting what races they can play, but it's about creating, quote unquote, rarities in the world. So for me, like humans, some elves, dwarves and gnomes and goblinkin are kind of like the common races. So it's more likely that you're going to be seeing, as a character walking around in this world, you're going to be seeing those races most often. But that doesn't mean that they are the only races you can choose from. And so what I also think is really cool about this is that when a player chooses a race for their character, it allows you to create lore for races that you might not have considered before. I've been a big advocate lately of allowing the players to build the world with you by describing what they find when they go, picking plants and stuff, or what kind of people see on the streets and things like that, taking into consideration all of the elements of the society and the custom world as a whole as you presented it. And that's why I think the reference document is really useful for that situation, because you may have pre-established lore, but that doesn't mean it's the end-all be-all. And that also doesn't mean that your character necessarily has to follow that lore. If, for example, with Drow, very typical, they're always following Lolth and stuff, and they're considered evil. But whenever a player character is a Drow, they don't have to be evil or anything like that. They don't have to like Lolth. They might have been banished from Lolth or something like that.
And maybe there's a whole society of Drow that don't follow Lolth, and maybe that we've added something to the lore.
Yeah, and that's what I like about it. So that's pretty much my answer.
Yeah, what I find with this one, there's a huge difference between running wild with something and being open to the options. There's a missing key point there, which is discussion. I'll say, like, lately especially, like, restriction breeds creativity. I like being able to put up front with every new campaign I'm running that reference document idea of, these are the races, just so you know up front, these are the races you are allowed to take, and these are the races that are common, that are uncommon, based upon the setting. And that can change. It doesn't have to follow Faerun. It doesn't have to follow the player's handbook. There's a lot of power in changing that. And a lot of new opportunities for storytelling. You could have a world where humans are rare. What a concept. Like, the human race is rare. How about the dominant race is Dragonborn? Or maybe the dominant race, like dominant, or like the most common, is an Aasimar. What does that change in the world? But a lot of this is, that also depends on what type of setting you're going to be making. But the big thing here is, I am all for asking and then working with the lore and the options as presented at the beginning. And if you want something that might go against it, or is divergent, or is like extra rare, or isn't even on the document, ask, and we'll see if it's appropriate to work with you on that. And that's very, very different than showing up randomly with something from Dragonlance, which isn't even a part of your setting, and then thinking that the rules work a certain way because they just love Dragonlance, or they just love Lord of the Rings, or they just love some other media, and they bring that to the table thinking, well, of course it fits, but there was no previous discussion. And that's, I think, the big clicker here, because there's a big difference between saying you can do everything and saying everything might be an option, but talk to me first, and we'll figure out how it fits into the world. Because those are two very different options and very different executions. I ran into it a lot in the early days of DMing professionally. I'd have say, oh yeah, well, UA, you should ask me first. And then people would show up with Unearthed Arcana stuff that doesn't fit, or I didn't give them permission for, and went, oh, of course it works. Of course it, no. And I have to, be strict on that. But that's right as they get to the table, instead of everyone else who has previously discussed with me what their options are and how they all fit together. That's very different. So when someone says, do you let them run wild? I never let them run wild, because that changes the expectations at the table. Whatever they're running wild with, they're talking to me about, and that grounds it. So I guess the flat answer is all options could be open, but there's a discussion element that's present in how it represents itself and how it comes to being.
Yeah, the big thing I think here is why do you want to play your weird race? Like for a lot of players, it ends up being a mechanics thing. They like Vidalcan from Ravnica are a very specific race to a very specific world. They just want to play the race, right? They just want to play the mechanics. If you just are like, oh, you're a human that has these racial traits, like a lot of players are fine with that. Sometimes it's an aesthetic thing. So I know my mom really likes Loxodon, which are also from Ravnica, because she likes the idea of playing an elephant person. Like, is an elephant person so alien to the D&D worlds that we're used to? When you can have cat people and you can have lizard people, are elephant people really that like, whoa? So I really do think it all comes back to, why do you want to play your race, and what kind of story do you want to tell with your race, like you guys have been saying. I do think that the one time it's okay to basically let your players run wild is when you set the expectation beforehand that it's okay to run wild, which again comes back to the permission thing. So there have been games I've run, like when I ran the Essentials kit, I was basically like, this is just going to be casual D&D. Bring what you want. We're not going to intensely talk about world continuity or anything. Mm-hmm. Bring something, we'll play it, see how it works, and maybe you'll surprise me. I had a player say, I want to be a neutral good Yuan-ti, and the reason I'm neutral good is because the snake ritual didn't strip me of my emotions like everybody else. That was a really clever way to create a unique character with a pretty like rare player race, like Ian was saying. So sometimes if you don't start from kind of a restrictive thing, if it's open but work with me, like you guys have been saying, your players can surprise you with some of the creative things that they come up with.
Yeah. Now, this question comes from one of my more industrial players here and there, which is, how do you run a believable economic system? And some of this ties into city building and world building. And I think that there's a couple branching paths that can come from this. And like we were discussing a little bit in the pre-show, an economic system doesn't have to be a thing that the players pursue. There are some industrious players that, like, I've had players at the table that are like, I want to go to the bank and make an investment. I want to put in for bonds. I want to, like, wait, what? And they're looking for different forms of income that kind of ties into their lives in some way, which was always interesting to me. I think building an economic system, if you have a group that is all for exploring that, go for it. If you don't have a group that's all for exploring that, barely touch it. Like, you don't have to. For me, I'm a numbers guy, and for me, it helps me ground the cityscape to have an economy, but it's really more of a descriptor. I don't need to know the numbers. It's like, what does this city export? What does this city import? And that might provide opportunities for the players, because that's where that can be really cool. Hey, what does this city have a shortage of? And then that'll have other socioeconomic and social consequences that will change the city or might impact the players, especially if they're, like, depending on their status as well. It's more to have a believable economic system. I think it is import, export, and then if there's a shortage, how does that affect? You don't even have to worry about the numbers of, gold, platinum, whatever. You can say the basic, the basic person has 30 gold on their person, or the basic person has 20 silver on their person, and then you have a decent idea of who's poor and who's not, and where they all fit into society. It's there, and then I think even before you get into any sort of numbers, it's the roles in society. So when you build up businesses, this comes up a lot. Like, I see a lot of businesses that end up just being bakeries, magic shops, library, armor. And those are your four main businesses. What other businesses could exist? And then what are the other needs in that city? We experienced it, Stormrack has a whole stretch of different businesses. You go to Feathertongue and it's all like high art and fashion. And it's a very different kind of economy because they have different values that are in play and different laws that are in play. There are jewelry shops, but then you might have a jewelry shop that's purely aesthetic, and then you might have a jewelry shop that's magic amulets and magic rings. And how is that different? So when you think about an economy, I think it's less and less about how the numbers work out, because that's the background economics. What it really comes down to is, what are the businesses? What role do they fulfill in the society? What's important to this society? And then I like to think about what it is. How does this society connect to other societies, which is where that import and export comes from. Maybe they need a certain import of a certain crystal, but they can't get that crystal. It's given to them by another city that they trade this other thing for that only they can get. And now you have a relationship. So it's about building, it's about relationships.
So you mentioned a lot of things that I totally agree with there, that if you want to make it like a realistic economy, you have to think about the imports and exports. But you also have to think about like the haves and the have-nots, social classes, and the structure of what it means to be rich versus what it means to be poor, especially if you've got an industrial civilization, for example, in Geras, where it's more kind of like 1920s and stuff, but you got like spell gems and new technologies. You've got the whatever it's called, the lightning rail, which is like a train. And, when I think about this kind of thing, I'm looking at who has what and who doesn't have that stuff. Like for the central region of my world, Corsara, Eskara has most of the natural resources and stuff. And then, but they aren't super technically advanced or anything. They have to export all their resources to a different place to get them worked on and create these new technologies, which is where all the dwarves and gnomes live. And so I think it's really interesting because this can create conflict as well. So the economy really impacts like the whole world. Like it's not just about money. It's also about resources and surviving, and the difference between surviving and thriving, which is really interesting to me. So the way I did it was, if somebody's looking for a template, like more specifically, the way I did it is one region, Eskara, has most of the natural resources, the ore, the minerals, all that stuff. And they're okay. Sometimes they come up with some neat things, but mostly it's the dwarves who are, and the gnomes who are manufacturing items and creating spell gems and other things like that. But then that's just, ores, that's just technology. What about food? Well, I have a different region, which is mostly taking care of all the agriculture for the whole continent, really. And that region is pretty rich just because they have so much of the workable land, whereas Escara tends to be a little bit drier, more arid, because, mining. And Serac, which is where the dwarves are, is a volcano. This other region has lovely fields, and they are really close to the ocean and stuff, so it's very fertile lands. So that's really kind of the basic stuff you can consider. Where's the money coming from? Where's the technology coming from? And where's the agriculture coming from? So those are kind of like the big questions macroeconomically. And that,
I did not even realize I did create all of that for Geras. I didn't even go into it. But you're right. If you look at it, that setting from that macroeconomic way, everything's there. Agriculture comes from Elwyn. Technology comes from Rand because they looted it from Sirica. Wait, you guys may not have known that yet. But yeah, that's awesome. Nice.
Yeah, it's really cool. And for me, I didn't realize this stuff until I really started taking college classes on the subject.
Right.
But it was always there. It's just you don't always recognize what you've got going on when it comes to your economy. And sometimes, you'll never recognize it until a player brings it up. They're like, "Oh, hey, I was looking for this particular, magic item. I know you don't really have magic items in your campaign, but where would I find something that could do a job or similar to that job, or something like that, like a prosthetic, for example." Some people have worlds, I think in Geras actually, where you can have a kind of like a Warforged prosthetic almost, where you've lost a leg or something, but you could just take the same principles and wire it in, just like in Full Metal Alchemist, really. But that's another topic, but that's how I look at it. Macroeconomics, what are the basic needs of society, and where can you divide it up so that it becomes contentious and interesting? How do you make peace? Yeah. How do you make peace between regions?
Yeah. And that also, it lends credence to if there was a war or if there was a civil dispute, what could it be about? And that adds extra layers to, well, no, the people who make the agriculture are basically being enslaved, or they're being taxed on something. There's something that is valuable for them to fight for. Often when we think about an economy, we think about just economy, it's money. It's just money. When actually an economy is based on goods and services, and it's where those come from and who is making them. And that people have fought about economy for ages in our own world, and it's a common place because it has to do with production and people's rights. There's a lot there that's possible. So if you have a full understanding of how those different macroeconomics impact the world and impact the city and impact its people, those also provide opportunities for the players, and that has nothing to do right now with the individual micromanaging numbers of the gold, platinum, whatever. It's all about the goods and services.
Yeah. So my 2 cents on this is first, when you're including an economic system in your game, it's kind of like a graphics card where the more detailed you get, the more slowdown there's going to be.
Right.
So if you want to be if you are as a party have decided that this is where you want to invest your game time, this is something to explore, right? And this is again from the DM's perspective, creating an experience. Know that the more time you decide to spend on this, the less time you're spending adventuring and killing monsters and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So if your party wants a more balanced approach, your job as the DM, because again this is a DM question, is to create enough graphics that your players get an idea and the graphics look pretty without slowing down the system so much it doesn't run, right? Exactly. It's like Skyrim. If you put too many mods on, soon the game just stops running, unless you're playing regular Skyrim, and then the game just stops running. So when it comes to, and again, it's how do you create a believable economy? So having taken economics 101 in college, which makes me an expert, the study of economics, the main thing is what regulations do you need to put into place to get the best outcome, right? So a big part of it is not only paying attention to the macroeconomics, the import, export, the supply and demand, it's also looking at the legal part of it too. So what regulations have been put in place for whatever reason, we have to regulate how much we import so that we don't kill all the displacer beasts and don't drive them extinct, or what would happen if a corporation did do that. That's the plot of Final Fantasy VII is, like magic is a finite thing. And if we start sucking it away, soon the planet's going to die. And that's not a good thing. So when you start looking at the regulations, you also, the way you make an economy believable is you make it impactful, right? The economy is one of those things where it's completely separate from you unless it's somehow directly affecting you. So whether that means, prices have been raised, so the local grocery store your character has next to their apartment goes out of business, this ties back to the have-nots, So it's how does the economy directly impact your character in an emotional way. That's how you get your character. That's how you make the economy believable. Because we can debate systems all day, but unless you can't clear rent, you don't value it emotionally the same way. So it's one of those things where it's to me, you make an economy believable by having it directly impact the players in an emotional way. And again, how complicated you want to get with it is more up to you and the players and that dynamic. But yeah, even things as little as, at one shop, a good costs one price, and at another shop, it costs a different price. That's going to create a believable economy because it's not just flat 50 gold for a potion here, 50 gold for a potion there, and then you can tie it, because our next question is going to tie into this with side jobs, in that, maybe it's cheaper for you to just go to the alchemy shop and buy all the ingredients and make it yourself. But the risk reward game state wise now is maybe you mess it up and you don't roll high enough, and so you wasted all those ingredients, whereas you have a more consistent product if you buy from a professional. So our next question is, what are some jobs that player characters can partake in that go beyond smithing, and beyond side jobs that are like obviously tied to class distinction? So like, a cleric can do burial rites, or a druid has herbalism kit, right? Or like the ability just to create magic scrolls or items, which have more of like a combat gamey thing, right? How do you implement side professions into an adventure to give them some weight?
Yep. So I run a little kobold monk who's a drunken master, and he is a culinary artist. And his whole obsession is trying to get the perfect meal for each person that he meets. And I like the idea of a cook, just as an adventurer, because you're visiting all these different places. So he might, it adds extra weight and credence to the exploration aspect of what does this region, what's their signature dish? What does this tavern have for their menu? What would happen if I made tea out of this random leaf I found? And it shouldn't create extra work for the DM. It might just be a thing that's sort of a creative outlet or a way to improvise a little bit. But I've also seen people use it as, it's not even alchemy. It's food. It's just food. And if they get good enough, maybe they open up a shop that they put their recipes out, and they train a couple chefs, and then they still go on their adventures. But now they can, I found this new recipe, and they send it by hawk, or they send it by teleportation circle back to their restaurant. And it adds an extra layer of them paying attention to other aspects of the world that aren't the great nation that's at war. It's, what is the signature dish of this place? Oh, what's this burgeoning baker that I wonder what you make? And, this is a neat pastry. What's it made out of? It's, there's a new conversation there that's been really rewarding to explore, it also makes me think about, how are things made? If I had a character who wanted to make a medieval cake, what sort of ingredients would I want to find? And then as I'm moving around the world, like, oh, are those eggs? Can I grab some eggs? Like, oh, I need some milk. I need some dried milk. I need these ingredients. Oh, sugar. I need sugar. And there's an extra layer there. That's not just I walk through the forest. It's I walk through the forest and I pick these herbs. Or, ooh, are there berries? I take these berries. I'm going to turn that into something later. And that's a new layer of depth. That I can say, oh yes, those berries I picked 2 sessions ago or something like that. I make a pie for the party, or I make a pie and I sell it. There's something really cool about that, and it has a very explorative focus. So a cook, and now there are culinary supplies. That's great. There are tons of different tools, like cobbler's tools, and leatherworkers tools. I mean, leatherworkers starts to move toward armor, but a cobbler, you can make boots. And how interesting would it be if you wouldn't even have to make a mechanical, like an impactful thing in the game. Just, I have these boots and I made them myself. And you have someone who's learning to make boots. How interesting would it be if you had a Dragonborn that can't wear standard boots, and you make boots for them that fit them? And there's no mechanical bonus. It's something cool you can do. There's things you guys want to say. Go ahead.
Yeah. So first, this is, again, we put this in the DM category because it's, as a DM, how do you position this aspect of the game to carry weight for the players, right? Yeah. So that these decisions matter. And ultimately, I find that the ones that I find happiest as a player, and the ones that I've seen other players be satisfied with incorporating this element, is when other players choose to engage with them, right? So it's like, it's not a DM thing. I mean, as a DM, you can set the expectation that you'll care about each other, but it's things like imagine what it would be like, Adam, if another player was interested in your kobold cooking and would invest money in getting you better supplies to become a better cook. All of a sudden, that's the side job lends a conversational aspect that can tie 2 characters together. Yeah. So it lends weight because it invests emotionally in the dynamic between 2 players, right? And it's just another bridge to kind of get them talking to each other. To go back to your example with the cobbler, I do think that if you do offer some kind of mechanical bonus, it would encourage players to want to do that more, even if it's something like, I can sell this Dragonborn some boots for a little extra gold, Right. Or it might offer them not necessarily a mechanical bonus, but a world bonus. So it's as a Dragonborn, I'm showing off these beautiful boots that were tailored for me by one of my party members. And again, that puts me in a better standing with the nobles at a gala. Right. So you get some kind of benefit. You get rewarded for the fact that you engaged with the game in this way, even if it's not a statistical bonus, So for me, I've always found that you can give these side jobs more weight if it's maybe part of the character's motivation. So your kobold cook, they're adventuring so that they can pay to open up their own bakery, right? For Dragon Heist, it was you guys were running an inn because that was your player base, So it served the game function of, we have somewhere we can go back to, but it also served as enough of a mini game function that it also explained why you guys had enough money to go buy equipment, and it gave you a safe place to stay, and it literally grounded you in the world because you had a place to go back to at the end of each adventuring day. And it can also just, again, the way you integrate a side job is you make it part of your character. So to also bring back Dragon Heist, we all remember Jane the accountant. She's the one that we can remember. And the way I rewarded her for her commitment to that side job is that was her way, again, to connect with other characters' dynamics. All of the businesses by the end of that campaign, use Jane as their accountant, you know? So like it was a way for the party to become friends with all of their neighbors because she had a service you provided, which goes back to the economy question. So part of the way that you can create a believable economy is by integrating the interests that your players have and again, allow it to impact them emotionally, which doesn't have to be a bad thing. Maybe their business gets booming and they earn a lot more gold than they thought they would out of their investment. That's how you get them engaged with the economy.
Yes, and beyond all those things, I just have like a couple of examples if you guys are still like stumped or something for possibilities. Besides, cooking or cobbling, which are both really cool. I like the cooking one especially. Perhaps your character has a hobby that can become useful later on. So mapping, for example, if you're going into unknown territory, or better yet, if you're going into the Feywild, where everything's crazy and nobody knows where they are at any point in time, if you're mapping, then maybe that could have some sort of scholarly value later on when you go back to the material plane and you're like, I made an excursion into the Feywild, here's what I found. And I found that the landscape shifts a lot, but there are these elements that seem to be consistent, even though it's kind of a wild place. Another option is that maybe they have a hobby of collecting rocks. That's something I love to do personally. So sometimes you can pick up maybe not precious stones, but semi-precious materials that might go into spell gem making, or might be useful for just material components that you could sell at a at a wizard school or wizard shop and things like that. Those are things that I think of when I'm thinking of how I can go beyond just making materials that could be useful, or better yet, sometimes you can use these things that you find, for example, again, the semi-precious stones, in some sort of magic ritual that you might not have foreseen, but you just happen to be collecting all these rocks. Wouldn't it be nice to be able to do something with them? Because crystals in D&D are generally considered somehow inherently magical. So that could be useful at some point. Like if you need to hollow some ground or whatever, or hallow, not hollow. But yeah, that's just some examples. So our next question is on a different note. What are the pros and cons of an intense versus quote unquote fluffy campaign? For me, what this means, just to define it a little more clearly, is that an intense campaign is probably like a serious campaign, emotional investment. You're concerned about the state of the world, and that's why you're adventuring. And you're taking into consideration serious consequences for your character, tragic consequences even. Fluffy campaigns are like, whatever, kind of more of a beer and pretzels experience, or we're just having a laugh, really. Like there's all these scenarios that we come up with, and we're so interested in how they play out, but we're not concerned that we're all going to die at the end or something like that. And I think for me, the pros to an intense campaign are that if you enjoy emotional storytelling, if you enjoy being immersed in a world where you have a motive and you have a quest, and those two things fit together perfectly, and why you're here, that's like really great for the intense campaigns. The Gothic horror, for example, in Curse of Strahd. The con is probably it can be emotionally draining. I actually write stories for my characters, the backstories, and I personally can experience the anxiety or the emotional turmoil that my character is going through as I write the story, because it's just that powerful. It can be that poignant. On the other hand, fluffy campaigns, I really like them a lot. I have a lot of like quips or one-liners sometimes when I'm at the table, and the DM sometimes rewards inspiration for that, even though you can only have like one inspiration, according to the raw. Sometimes it's like, whatever, you get like 3 inspirations, over time, over the course of the session that you can use just because the one-liner was so good, or both of them were. And that I think can be really useful for a scenario where your table is just more concerned about having a good time with each other as a social experience, and enjoying each other's company, rather than creating a very emotional shades of gray story for you all to witness. And they can both be good, and I honestly like both ways. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's brilliant that you kind of define both of those a little bit more, because working off of your definitions, my answer would be that so-called fluffy campaigns, I feel, um, the nice thing is they can work for everyone. So like if you have like a random friend come in, it's easier to include new people that might only be playing for a session or two or something. And the risk of upsetting each other is a lot less. Because again, like you said, Ian, not everyone's like super invested in the story. Now, I do find that one of the cons is that it can be less rich in terms of the overall experience. Like I find like the fluffy campaigns are nicer if somebody wants to try out a build, but they don't want to try to commit to that character's story or expression or whatever. I also find that it can be a lot harder to keep fluffy campaigns running because you don't have the same investment. It's a lot easier to cancel something you don't really care about versus something that you have a lot of emotional investment in. So like Gray Owls, it was getting to the point that like it was really upsetting to miss a session. You have that more emotional investment up front. Whereas an intense campaign is like the opposite. It can be much more rewarding. The experience can be much more enriching. But again, it's a lot easier to forget that the player is not their character. Like there have been several times where like I've been treated at a table of an intense game where I am the character I'm playing, instead of seeing that difference of, this is what I said in character, but that doesn't mean I agree with it as a person, And I think that when people start to dive more into that immersion, that membrane starts to thin a little bit. And it can become a challenge, especially if, you think you're ready for one thing, but you realize you're not. It can be a lot harder to step out and bow out of a game that's intense when it may not be the most appropriate fit, So, now, Adam, this was a question that you had put into the thing, so you might be able to clarify it a little bit more if like the definitions you were kind of that the original question person were asked, if it was like a little different, or if you have a different answer.
Specifically, the pros and cons of intense versus fluffy. I think that, and we have to kind of think about what fluffy means and what intense means, because I think of fluffy as in there's not a lot of investment and I think of fluffy as short, like a marshmallow fluff. It's short and sweet. So a one shot feels fluffy to me. The person who asked this, we're asking for, I think specifically the psychological pros and cons, but then again, I'm not a psychiatrist. So I just think of what can you get out of a quote unquote fluffy campaign? What can you get out of an intense campaign? And I think that a fluffy campaign it's lighter, and there's less investment in a fluffy campaign. So this is when you can experiment with builds. This is when it's almost like if things go terrible, it's a haha, okay. And this is where that one shot scenario or a 3-shot scenario comes into play, where you can take a small short form concept and mess around with it. And this is where, hey, we don't mind if something breaks. We don't mind if all of this goes terribly wrong, if everybody dies, if it doesn't matter. And in that way, it's almost like a form of beneficial escapism. It's just, I just get to try this, and then whatever happens, and then it's done, and I don't have to think about it anymore. And then I think the con of that is that there's less depth, less investment. And I completely agree with you that if you have a longer running fluffy campaign where things don't matter, those are the ones that fizzle. Those are the ones that we don't really care about. Or it's a lot easier to cancel those. It's a lot easier to justify canceling them because there's no investment. And sometimes when there's no investment, that can be nice because there's less weight to their decisions. You don't have to think about, oh, I really messed up my relationship with that NPC, and now I really missed that opportunity. You don't agonize about that because it's it doesn't matter. And really, at the end of the day, it's a game. We shouldn't agonize over that too much.
Well, yeah, and I do think that that's the other thing to recognize is when they creep into each other, because I've had that happen where, let's do that. What you guys have both mentioned now, like a one shot is good for a fluffy thing. Cursed Castle was one of the most intense one shots I ran that ended up having a lot of emotional investment. I didn't go in planning for it, but it's what the players brought that day. There was a whole thing where, like, inside of the first hour, the vampire bad guy, Lord Radovan, like, snuck into the PC. There was, like, one of the players was playing, like, a 19-year-old girl, and he snuck into her bedroom to feed on her, and she woke up right before he bit her. And it was, like such a dark thing to have happen, and how they received it and how they responded and everything. It ended up being a pretty intense game that it wasn't necessarily meant to be intense, but that's what the players wanted that day. And we've talked about Night Owls, where Night Owls, like Karama, started as just, I want to see what Druid's like. The first session of Night Owls, Adam was like, hey, I know I capped it at 6, but if you want to be a 7th player, I'll let you in. And considering that, I was like, well, I want to play a support character where I'm going to enjoy making everybody else enjoy their characters more, you know? So it was a real fluffy concept. And by the end, it was really intense emotional investment.
Yeah.
Grey Owls, in a lot of ways, ended up the opposite, where at chapter 15, we went from deep emotional investment to Melisande and Solomon are on vacation in the north and everything's always okay. I love you too. Like, it ended up being a lot fluffier because, yeah, there's bugs to fight, and we could die, but I mean, we could always die. So it and by the end, of course, it circled back. But the idea is that when we're talking about fluffy versus intense, it's more valuable to practice recognizing where you're at than, like, dwelling on the pros and cons of each to try to artificially create an experience without it organically developing into what it's organically going to develop.
My next point on that is precisely that. I think that the term fluffy and intense changes, and it fluctuates from table to table. And I would go in like Feywild. I went in with the intention of, this is going to be fluffy and silly and strange because it's the Feywild. And it has become emotionally satisfying and socially satisfying, and in some cases emotionally intense in ways I never could have predicted. And yet it's still good. Like, it's and I think fluffy and intense don't have to be qualitative terminology. It's the tone, and it's a currency tone. It's like the current tone, and I think it runs the spectrum, beginning of campaign all the way to the end, session to session, table to table, and it will change. And I think that's why I wanted to try and clarify what it is about intense and fluffy. And I wonder if it more means going in with silliness or going in with depth. But at the same time, I still think that changes. You might go in with a certain intention, and that intention, in my experience, my intention always shifts even a little bit. It may shift a lot, but it's always going to shift a little bit. And I wonder what it comes down to when it says fluffy as a one shot where there's no investment. And I think about a one shot that Ian and I were a part of that are just we made characters. There wasn't even a combat really, and everything was socially explorative and funny and adorable. And I thought, well, my character could die, and I don't really mind because this was a fun little experience anyway. I was satisfied anyway. So I wonder if fluffy means you throw away and intense means investment, or whether the way I see it as it's a tone that fluctuates. And I think both have pros and cons. But it's recognizing, are you still invested even if it's fluffy? Are you still invested even if it's intense? And I think that's what matters more.
Yeah, I think that it can be a little of both. It comes back to a personal definition. And all of this, it being transient, it changing moment to moment, also does not mean that you as the dungeon master, it doesn't matter what you do, something's going to happen that's not according to plan. You can still influence it. And we'll talk about it much more next time, but it's basically how you choose to mechanically roll things is going to encourage or discourage habits from your players. So if your player tries something cartoonish and out of the box and just completely out of the realm of possibility, and you allow it, you are now encouraging your players to try wacky cartoonish things because they work, right? If you as the DM, your players want to try to emotionally invest and they try to do something a little more intense, and you do not reflect a change in their relationship with the NPCs or a change in anything, again, you are discouraging them from being able to play a little more intensely. And the same can also be true. Like if you're, you can play games that are too intense, like Ian said earlier, when it comes to settings. Like if you're playing too intense, if it's not fun anymore, if it's not rewarding and players are snapping at each other, or they're trying to police each other, that means that you as the DM have set a tone that is frankly probably going to be more toxic than it is going to be rewarding. So it is a spectrum, and you do have a little play, and there is an ebb and flow, but we can also dig a new path for the river to flow, even though it's flowing. It's not just I guess we'll flood this year.
Yeah, so. And when I say like things have become intense, they haven't become bad. They haven't become toxic. It's like we started with a fluffy idea, and then it became a little more intense, and now it's curbing back toward fluffy. All of that still stays within the realm of a positive table and of a cooperative, fun narrative table. It's just we can navigate that with trust and empathy. And last for our DM section of this is what are some challenges or benefits of mixing the I'm just playing style of player with the full immersion big story style?
Yeah, I would just say that one challenge is I have seen and played and DM'd for a variety of groups. And the more extreme a player is in one direction versus another on this, the more you'll always have a part where someone's left out. I'm not one that really, I'm cool with spotlight time, but if the gameplay is only you get your spotlight, now you get your spotlight, now you get your spotlight, and we rotate back to your spotlight, I find that really boring and disengaging because now you're not integrating, again, the dynamics between two players. So usually when I do a spotlight thing, I try to have a spotlight on two players at the same time. So that it's not, I'm going to go off and do my own thing while you go off and do your own thing. It's we as a team may split off into smaller teams, but that doesn't mean I don't allow it ever. It's just as a general trend. That's the worst part is feeling like you're left out of the loop. And what it does is it, again, starts to encourage that disengagement. Because it doesn't matter if I play, it doesn't matter if I don't. So I'm just along for the ride. I find that to be one of the challenges of mixing tables like that.
Mm-hmm. And I find when I have sometimes I'll have players that don't feel comfortable jumping in with that full immersion part. But if I have a player who is comfortable with that full immersion, and I know that this other player would like to get to that point, then I'll pair them up in a scenario. Or it will come up socially that it might be appropriate for them to be in the same space. Sometimes I have a mentorship thing where I'll speak to a player that I know is comfortable and is like, well, based on your character, you might have some connections with this other character, and maybe we can find ways for you to bring them along when you're doing stuff. And then I'll find that if I try to model it in a way to say, okay, well, you're doing this and you're doing this, let's have both of you interact during this time, the players will start to, it takes them a while sometimes, but the players will start to say, hey, Jimmy Bob Thornton, do you want to come with me to go do this thing? Or, hey, you're really good at making sure that people aren't lying. You're really good at insight. Do you want to come with me to do this thing? And in that way, there's a lot more of pulling people out of just, I'm just here for the ride, so that they might be able to experience some of that full immersion. If they've never experienced a full immersion or a big story style, this gives them the opportunity. They could also decline. Do you want to come with me? Nah, I'm okay. I'm going to watch from here. Is also, I think, all right. It's just, I hate the feeling of having someone left out. And I very rarely, there was a point in time that I would like try to do, well, it's your time and now it's your time, now it's your time. And it's so much better to have joint spotlight. It's so much better to have the ensemble cast interacting, even if it's, you know, three characters out of the 6 or 3 characters out of the 5, because more are now involved. And often when that's happening in our current campaigns, the people who are watching are everyone else's biggest fan. They are just, oh my God, I can't believe he said that. Oh, wow. And they're, the characters aren't present in the scenario, but the players are. They're engaged too, even if the characters aren't a part of this scenario. And then when they hop back, they've got their own things to do as well. But I find that so much more organic, and it's less and less about, well, let's make sure that he has equity and he has the right amount of time, and you've been active for 5 minutes, so let's make sure that you're active for 5 minutes, hit the clock. And it's more about, well, was this satisfying? Do we feel like we came to a cool narrative close, or all 3 of you together in this scenario got what you wanted out of it? I'm not timing that, you know, Knox spoke for a minute and Jim Bob Thornton spoke for 2 minutes, so Knox needs another minute to talk. It's, did you say what you needed to say? Did you do what you needed to do? Okay. And then we can move on. And it's more about the experience than it is necessarily about the time.
Yeah, and I think there's something to consider there, that there can also be like kind of an internal challenge for the DM when considering how you're mixing these player styles, because I've had players who are just generally quiet. They have a really cool character and they're really enjoying their character, but they're kind of quiet, and I'm not sure if they're feeling immersed or not, or I'm not sure if they feel like they're getting left out. So, for example, we had a barbarian in the Blood in the Valley campaign named Oops, and he didn't really talk too much. Like, he was a little comedic when he did talk, but there wasn't too much to be said because his character motivations were just kind of, he kind of just goes with the party. He's enjoying hanging around. But for me, I was concerned that maybe I wasn't doing enough as a DM to involve them in the story. And I confronted the player with this query, and they said, no, I'm just hanging out. It's I'm really liking what you've been doing so far. This is the character, And I'm like, oh, okay, well, great. But then later on in the campaign, towards the end of the campaign, there was a change. The barbarian died, and we didn't really have a way to revive them. And they were like, oh, I guess, do I have to roll up a new character now? And I'm like, maybe. Let's see what happens. And we managed to kind of improv. I hate using the word ex machina because it sounds like I'm just like saying, by the hand of God, I give you life. And
that's a DM's job.
Yeah, it's also kind of my job to protect the players and their characters from kind of unfair circumstances, which would put them in a scenario where it's just annoying. Like, we're so close to the end of the campaign and your character dies. Damn it. What happened was, this was the gateway really for that character to have some really interesting story defining moments where they were revived through Fae magic. And they then became tied to the Fae, and this kind of spark of like passion kind of showed up. I mean, they're a barbarian, so there's always passion, but there was this defining character moment that I really liked. So you have to consider that players are not static either. They can change between proactive, reactive. They can change between full immersion and I'm just along for the ride, and that's okay. So that's kind of my take on it.
Yeah, I think one of the big distinctions to have is a character that's like along for the ride, like you said, or maybe a little quieter. They may not be as comfortable speaking up, versus a character that's ambivalent and just doesn't care, you know? Like it's the character that's on, or the player that's on their phone the entire time, you know? That's like, and not paying attention. So you ask them what just happened and they have no idea. That's a completely different, like, it's not even a style, it's a behavior than like a character that might, or a player that might be too nervous to try acting in a different way. Which is one thing that we noticed when we started typing out our thoughts. We had players that were uncomfortable speaking up and acting, but typing everything out, they were really expressive, you know? Yeah. So I think the solution to this one is honestly, just have a strong session 0. That if you have a strong session 0 where you lay out your expectations, kind of what you're looking at for a tone of a campaign, what you're looking at for your players, even a player that's just a little quieter, a little along for the ride, they voluntarily signed up for it. It's not like you're pulling one over on them, right? Or if you're planning kind of a lighter game, you're not the players that really want full immersion. Like we had that with Night Owls too, where like, you know, the opposite of the Kurama problem, which is I create a throwaway character that I end up falling in love with. You know, it's this character is really intense, like inappropriately intense for a teenage game. Like we've had those as well, where it's like, you know, I'm bringing my character, you know, beyond tragic backstory. Like it's like, probably not for this game. Hold on to that for a future game, or might cross a boundary that I want, you know? So it is, when you can establish the expectations, like I wouldn't consider Geras a dark world, but we've dealt with some less than light subject matter, you know? So just by setting that expectation of, I want to run something story-based, I want to run something thoughtful, you know? That a lot of players who before in my games would be the I'm just playing, or I prefer fluffy games. They've been showing me some quality stuff because I was clear with what I wanted. So I think that for this one, like Ian said, kind of like between fluffy and tense campaign, players aren't just I'm just here to play, or they're not just I'm emotionally invested. They too have an ebb and flow, you know? And if you get them on board to work with you, kind of like what we talked about earlier, then how can everyone not have fun, you know? And if they didn't, listen to them, listen to their reasoning for it. And you might learn more about them and more about yourself because of it.
All right, everybody, we are going to hit up the rest of our questions. People submitted quite a lot, so that's wonderful. We'll hit up the rest of our questions next time in episode 101 over here at the DM Shower Thoughts. So thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in to today's episode of the DM Shower Thoughts. You can find this podcast uploading in iTunes and soon Spotify. We've been submitted for approval for that, and Podbean. Every Friday around noon, and you find my blog, The GM's Corner, uploading stuff every Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, and every now and then on Wednesdays you'll see stuff from John's Study Hall or Notes from the Apprentice from Ian, and that's awesome over at AdamsDrakeProductions.com, where you can find a whole bunch of other stuff. And then go visit our YouTube channel, DM Shower Thoughts, over on YouTube, and we'll have all the links of that in our description down below. Have a wonderful day, everybody, and please game responsibly. Bye-bye now!
I strive to defend New Issa Talos and live up to my role as a spiritual leader.
I journey to increase my knowledge of the cusp and cosmos. It has been prophesied that there is destiny in my blood.
I fight for the honor of the name Steadyhand and the great kingdom of Earth.
I wander to find my true place in the world. I will protect my home and family at all costs.
A young ruler's grasp for power threatens an already fractured world. Meet the heroes in Arc 2 of Advantage, a 5th edition D&D audio drama. Find us on all podcast apps.